Salute, omnes, I am Ruminous, and today we are doing a review for Crash Bandicoot 2. Now this is for the remake, although they are pretty much one-to-one with the original, but there are some changes they made for the remake that do negatively impact the game. I'll point those out, but basically this is a review for both versions of the game because they are pretty much the same. Now Crash 2 starts off right after Crash 1 with a riveting story, where this goofy marsupial needs to collect crystals for Neo Cortex, who, this time around, is totally not evil. Just kidding, but Crash is known for spinning and not for his intellect. So Cortex is clearly manipulating him, but we get to collect shiny things, so who really is manipulating who? Where the first game was practically all jungle, this game takes place in the jungle, tundra, ocean, and the infinite cosmos. The game sets Crash on a course to collect crystals to help Cortex, but then later gems to stop him. It is as simple as the first game, and it pretty much is as simple as it needs to be. We all know that I'm here to slaughter these boxes and collect pretty minerals. I'm not really here for anything else. The time frame on this game is dependent on skill and knowing the secrets of the game. It takes me about 3 hours to beat about 100%, although I'd imagine new players may take 6 hours or so to figure out the secret levels, the proper paths and routes to take to get all the boxes, and that kind of thing. There are a few new actions to this game. The player can jump, run, body slam, spin, and slide along with a few combinations of these different actions. Overall, they are very consistent. There were a few times where I pressed and held the button down, assuming that Crash would do the thing, and then I plummeted into the core of the planet. Outside of these very few times, I had no issues where Crash would disobey my orders to slap these porcupines with the force of a neutron star. There is also an unlockable control to sprint, but that's really only available once the final boss is beaten, and most of the game would be done at that point anyway. The precision of this game is practically the same as the original. The player can repeat actions immediately, but cannot cancel out of a spin or jump itself. The player can let go of the jump to do smaller hops, and can spin while jumping or sliding. The player can cancel out of a slide by jumping or spinning, and can cancel out of their ice momentum with a body slam. The body slam itself is a limiting move as it has recovery frames, and the player cannot do any other action while getting up. There are plenty of checkpoints, and although death animations may take a moment to play out, retrying a section or level is almost instantaneous. There is no planned latency in the game, and every action reacts immediately. When an enemy is hit, they will rocket into the nether realm immediately, and collecting fruit or boxes adds immediately to the counter. The levels are designed to have an abundant use of the different controls. There is plenty of opportunity to jump and spin with the amount of enemies and boxes, and many hazards or enemies can only be defeated with a slide, but the body slam is mostly a gimmick for a few levels. Each control is useful, especially the sliding, considering the poor design of the regular jump in the remake, but the body slam is practically useless. Because it stops all momentum and plummets to the ground, the player has to be accurate to hit the target, but more importantly, it doesn't really fall any faster than a regular jump. Since a jump has the same properties as a slam, it makes little sense to ever use the body slam, except when you're required for the armored boxes, who will not escape my eternal wrath for wooden crates. The sprint is useful for evading attacks, but again, is only useful once you've beaten the game, so it really doesn't really do anything. The game gives full autonomy to the player to select levels, replay levels, go for speedruns, or just take a stroll through the woods. The levels are broken into sections of 5 levels that can be played in any order, but the boss needs to be defeated to get to the next set. The bosses do not take long to beat, and there are times when the story decides to jump in, but the story can be skipped, and it's not really frequent enough to cause problems. The character's movement in the remake is the same for all 3 games. It is fluid and very linear. You know how fast Crash will go until he hits ice and goes turbo mode into the ballerina penguin. The major issue is that Crash does not often jump high enough or far enough to make most jumps without going to the edge of each platform. The original did not have this problem, but this game constantly has Crash scrape his shins on the ledges as the platforms are just too far. Making Crash jump slightly higher, move slightly faster, or redesign the levels to match the movement would have fixed this issue. Fortunately, 2 and 3 have the sliding jump, which allows Crash to jump higher and help avoid this issue, but it does not excuse the fact that the regular jumps are basically useless. The camera is fixed behind and above Crash and will continuously move along with the character as he moves in a fully 3D environment. There are a few times where the player will need to backtrack for boxes, and the camera is pretty limiting as it really doesn't look too far behind you, but it is a clear design choice rather than oversight. The view helps keep Crash in the center of the frame, but he only takes about 10% of the entire view, which is enough to react to the killer whales jumping up to say an aggressive hello. Crash 2 has a much better handle on the growth for the complexity and difficulty. Enemies will start following Crash in later levels, and some enemies enemies will begin to change their hitboxes from jumping vulnerability to sliding vulnerability. Jumps have a much tighter timing, and the hidden areas of boxes become more vague. The flow is also much better in the sequel. By giving the player a choice of 5 levels at a time, the player can take a break from the more difficult levels if they need to, or they can get encouragement from seeing their progress for the entire section grow, rather than just beating a seamlessly endless gauntlet of levels. The color gems can be gathered pretty quickly in the game, limiting the need for backtracking, and the death runs only require about half the level, limiting the need for repeating levels over and over just to get stung by a swarm of angry bees. The inclusion of new enemies, more jumps, and tighter timing come at a reasonable linear pace throughout the entire game. Only a few levels have a strange spike in difficulty, and those are often in secret areas, so the game properly lets the player get used to the new challenges and doesn't force them to have these really difficult challenges when they can just get through the regular game and get prepared that way. This game is still difficult, but much less frustrating than the first one, since the inclusion of a sliding jump means that Crash will actually make the jumps. The last 2 sections definitely pump up the oofage with constant fields of nitro, swarms of hornets, and much larger hazards, and the more perfect jumps. The secret areas and gem or death runs are often much more intense than the regular areas, but are within reasonable limit, except for this ice level that requires a death run and proper backtracking, and I really hate it. The game is entirely sustainable for its initial playthrough with the variety of levels, environments, and the amount of collectibles, but also for its replayability for personal challenges and alternate routes. There's also speedrun challenges for beating the main game, and like I said, you get a sprint thing so you can kind of see how fast you can beat the game. There is an attempt at a story for Crash 2, although it's just as basic as it is for the first game, and it really should remain that way. Crash enters a trans-dimensional portal where Neo Cortex is manipulating Crash to get the power crystals, but Smart Sister Coco and Crazy Scientist tell him to get the gems instead so they can obliterate Cortex. Obviously, it's all weak method to get me to collect things, which I would have done anyway. The interruptions at various points are unnecessary, and they could have cut out a good bit of the story, and it would have made just as much impact and sense. The music, as always, is banging. The music is intense and threatening when giant bears are trying to give you a hug, but floaty sci-fi when in space. The music is catchy and relaxing when stressed out after trying to cross this savage gauntlet of nitro for the stupid level. The music tends to match the level and also increases in intensity when in the secret areas, which are the more difficult aspects. The sounds also carry over across the trilogy, which are likewise goofy and cartoonish to match the style, but are well designed and don't clash or are too loud. The body slam is a loud thud, and the ice is scraping, and these crab things are rusty and really need some WD-40. Crash 2 is much more reliable, but the remake still has the same issues that the standard gaps are too far from the normal jump. I suppose it's reliable in the fact that it's unreliable, but it really is a problem. Other than that, each section will have 5 levels, likely with a colored gem, at least 1 secret exit, and a boss with 3 HP after getting the 5 crystals. Some levels will have a bear to ride or a jetpack, but these are really easy to detect from the start of the level. The levels are about the same length, and the design or enemies are predictable. There are a few manipulatives in the game, most of which are assistive, since some of the levels may prove sadistic for inexperienced players. If the player dies about 5 to 7 times before beating the level or reaching the next checkpoint, Crash will receive a mask so they can take another hit. Eventually the game will also give a golden mask, take 2 hits, or change regular boxes to checkpoints to give more checkpoints in the level and give them some sort of progress. There are not many assistive mechanics, but the big one is that the game will reset the cycle of the moving platforms and enemies so that the player can plan a route accordingly after death and figure out the best pattern of movement. A cycle is when a thing repeats its animation, so it repeats in a cycle. So it starts at point A, point B, back to point A. So you can plan accordingly. Every time that this ends, you know that's going to start at point A, and you can just move and do what you need to do. There are a few detrimental mechanics, some of which help to make the game harder, others more frustrating. Certain enemies can only be eliminated by spinning, others only by jumping. This helps make it so that Crash has to diversify his moves and not just steamroll the game by jumping on everything. Some enemies can't be killed at all, where they instead become a moving hazard. Many alternate paths will make Crash backtrack through the level to get all the boxes, or to get all the collectibles in a single go, but you can make it easier on yourself by sometimes just repeating the level and not doing everything at once. In the remake, because it is more rounded and not polygonal, Crash will often slip off of ledges if he's just standing on the very edge or if he lands on the very edge of a platform. Because the original was all strictly squares, this was not an intended mechanic, but the new tech came with this problem, and it can cause a lot of unnecessary or unfair deaths for new players who don't know about the sliding jump yet. The levels and enemies are designed with great guiding mechanics to help the player figure out the secrets, where to go, and what not to attack. Enemies with spikes in the back should not be jumped on, the hanging icicles are menacing, and Elmer Fudd apparently really hates all furry animals in the woods. The levels are generally straightforward, but some have secret pathways that can be easily detected if the player is paying attention to certain enemies or the design of the background. The portals to the levels show what collectibles are available, level, and usually 2 gem slots show that there's a secret or some sort of thing somewhere. Since there's hardly any dialogue in the game, the design relies mostly on being intuitive to help the player understand and learn the game. The initial controls are taught, but many of the mechanics need to be learned by experiencing them. Based on the slow pace and open areas of the first few levels, the player should figure out that the enemies and hazards are on cycles, that the enemies do not respawn, and that the boxes are the true evil in this world. Many of the hazards are initially taught and shown in the safe environments, such as the Slammy Boys having distinct platforms and being far away from other enemies. There aren't many thematic mechanics, but there's just enough in the story that the player can make the assumption that the Earth is just surrounded by giant animals that have some sort of grudge against Crash for his pants-wearing movement. The game is meant to be goofy and not taken seriously, but what is in the game makes sense, I guess, within the story. Unlike the first game, this game has a non-repeatable, unique tutorial level. This is a small level with a few enemies, boxes, and slight ditches. Although some of the controls are directly stated, the player has the opportunity to see what the game is about, what the buttons do, and how to react to the obstacles. The tutorial could benefit from armored boxes, a small gap for sliding, some TNT, and nitro to show every basic thing in the game. It is great that the first pit is safe, allowing the player to learn how to jump, but the second pit is an abyss, teaching them about respawning if they fail. The UI UX in the game is properly designed with contrasting colors and decent empty space. The UI is comprised of a pause menu where the player can quit, resume, or go into options, but also has a separate section to see the percent progress in the game. The menu options are simple and logical. The text is bubbly and easily legible with a black outline and orange filling. The overall design of the colors, background, and foreground are easy to decipher, and the player should have no problem navigating the levels or determining what is an enemy, hazard, and platform. The original animations were thankfully no longer animatronic, but the remakes again have all the shared animations and models where it's possible to do so. The graphics have been upped significantly to make it much more detailed and beautiful, and even though the style is cartoonish and outlandish, everything looks unique, distinguishable, and more importantly, funny in a proper way. Just like the original, there are so many unique death animations, which make the game much more alive and can help the player reluctantly chuckle after the stupid firefly abandons me in the dark, cruel world. The animations are often colorful, ridiculous, or just absolute insanity. Crash correctly shows the fear anybody would have if a giant polar bear was chasing you in the jungle. Not only is it giant, but it's a polar bear in a tropical zone. This bear can survive anywhere, and it wants vengeance for climate change. Any slow motion is much more realistic, but the faster movements are often exaggerated to fit the cartoonish style. Crash 2 does a bit better with accessibility than the first game, with some of the increased actions and less restrictive challenges. The game is tight timing and plenty of moving hazards, but there's not so much on screen at a single time that it causes cognitive overload. The colors are different enough for the platforms, enemies, and hazards that those with colorblindness and similar problems should be able to decipher them easily. The font can't be changed, but it is big, bubbly, and scarce enough with decent kerning that it shouldn't be an issue for reading or lexical comprehension. Despite the challenge in the game, the enemies will often not cross a certain line in the level, and so players can wait and plan if needed, although many of the jumps or enemies will require depth perception. The game can be hard and may not be good for those with issues to reactions, but it is a fun and goofy game that offers some respite between the fast-paced sections, and the death runs do not require beating the entire level, reducing stress and panic. For a final score, I give the gameplay a 32 out of 35, the story a 4 out of 5, the sounds a 5 out of 5, mechanics a 27 out of 30, tutorial a 4 out of 5, the UI UX a 5 out of 5, graphics a 5 out of 5, and accessibility a 5 out of 5. Overall, I give the game a 5 out of 5. Crash 2 is actually my favorite of the series, and there is a very clear reason for it. The levels are diverse, fun, and there's enough challenge and plenty of shiny, pretty gems to collect. The sliding jump is a wonderful addition, and the challenges are not so frustrating as they are in 1. The secrets are pretty easy to spot, and the game is designed so that the gems can be acquired on initial plays, instead of having to backtrack through the entire game, again, like the first one. The growth and flow are great without becoming too frustrating, and they took out a lot of these brutal bridges. Thanks everybody for watching, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell to be notified of future videos. But until next time, wale te omnes.